Honey, I'm so sorry. You missed the delivery.
But it's okay. Making the baby's the fun part.
I'm convinced that the only reason for this film's existence is because someone really wanted to make that joke. Released on March 11th, 2005, Robots was the second animated feature brought to us by the folks over at Blue Sky, following their hugely successful inaugural outing with 2002's Ice Age. The film chronicles the life of one Rodney Copperbottom, played by Ewan McGregor, a scrappy young inventor who dreams of leaving the suburbs of Rivet Town behind for the hustle and bustle of Robot City to work for his idol, a benevolent entrepreneur named Big Weld, voiced by Mel Brooks, at his company to help make the world a better place. But he soon discovers all that glitters is not gold, as Big Weld Industries has been taken over by Ratchet, played by Greg Kinnear, a shiny capitalist who, needless to say, does not share his predecessor's vision, valuing profit over people by discontinuing production on all spare parts, thereby forcing robots to purchase overpriced upgrades. And those that can't afford them are dubbed outmoded and get collected by street sweepers to be sent to the chop shop, where they'll be broken down and recycled at the command of Ratchet's mother, Madame Gasket, played by Jim Broadbent. Now, with the help of some new friends played by Robin Williams, Amanda Bynes, Drew Carey, Harlan Williams, Jennifer Coolidge, and Halle Berry, it's up to Rodney to repair the citizens, discover the mystery behind Big Weld's disappearance, and show the world you can shine no matter what you're made of. Robots has always held such a special place in my heart for its memorable characters, gorgeous art style, and incredible world building. I may have only been 4 at the time of the film's release, but it was one of my earliest memories of developing such a short-term hyperfixation on a new piece of media. It also did help that it released very close to my birthday, so I had plenty of access to all of the merchandise available. Unfortunately, I've not been able to hang on to most of them over the years, and as much as I would love to buy them again, items relating to this film have become somewhat scarce, so almost everything is too rich for my blood. I mean, look how much they're charging for a single one of the Burger King toys. But while I loved Robots when it first released and watched it a lot over the following years, it wasn't until much later that I realised the sheer brilliance of this film and its biting social commentary about privatised healthcare and the class divide that has not only allowed it to maintain, but increase its relevance decades later, despite the film itself still languishing for the most part in relative obscurity. Thus, in celebration of its recent 20th anniversary, I wanted to discuss the film and why it's an overlooked masterpiece that deserves another shot. So, welcome to the Manifesto of Robots.
Who wants to get fixed?
Robots was the brainchild of director Chris Wedge, who was still busy working on Ice Age at the time of its initial conception, as well as artist, illustrator, and writer William Joyce. Joyce was no stranger to the realm of CGI animated worlds populated by mechanical marvels, as he was also the creator of the Playhouse Disney series Roly Poly Oly, which had been running since 1998. Before Rodney and co. leapt onto the page, the pair were collaborating on an adaptation of one of Joyce's popular children's books titled Santa Calls, though this project ultimately fell through. Yet from the ashes arose the idea of an animated feature that would take place in a world built and solely populated by robots, a visual concept that fascinated the pair of artists even if they didn't have any clue what the story of such a film would be. To get there, they'd need some help, which they received when executive producer Chris Meledandri brought in playwright David Lindsay-Abaire, believing his character-first mentality and strong sense of wit would be exactly what the film needed to get the gears moving. While he wouldn't remain on the film for long, many of his contributions are still found in the final cut, mainly through the characters and their names. When David exited the project, all further writing duties were handled by Lowell Gans and Bablu Mandel, who, despite having never worked in animation before, immediately threw themselves into the process. They fully embraced the medium's more inherently collaborative nature and the culture of Blue Sky, which encouraged ideas from every member of the production, no matter which department. Through this process, the team slowly understood the core idea behind the story they wanted to tell. What would it be like to exist as a robot who finds themselves becoming obsolete, forcing them to confront their mortality. This idea can be seen as far back as the original 2-minute test footage that featured an argument on a film set between an aging actor and a director, with both of these characters making their way into the final film in some form. But in hashing out these rough concepts and figuring out what they wanted to say with their art, a philosophy started to develop amongst the crew, fueled by nostalgia and dissatisfaction with how humanity had become far more wasteful in recent decades. They thought back to a time where things were not so disposable, and how pieces of technology were once able to be passed down through multiple generations because often they were easy to fix. Because of this, people held onto those items and developed an emotional attachment to them. But heading into the new millennium and the age of modern technology, that concept had seemingly become a thing of the past, with companies building lower quality products that were designed to break after a few years, forcing consumers to continuously replace and upgrade them. Thus, these items came to be seen as disposable. The concept of how technological advancement can also be a significant downgrade inspired the crew to divide the robot world into 3 distinct realms, each representing an era of industrial history that would then dictate their robot's characteristics. The Steam faction robots would be big, bulky, and unpolished, with many visible moving parts. The Combustion era robots were, in comparison, smaller, with moving parts mostly covered up by steel. Then finally, the high-end robots would be the most modern, with their inner workings entirely hidden below smooth, polished chrome surfaces. Here is also where the crew saw the ethos behind the villains of the story develop, as it became the struggle between the old and the new. How Ratchet plans to force unaffordable continuous upgrades on the public by discontinuing the far cheaper spare parts that were once used to easily fix the bots that were built to last. Now, in the spirit of trying to keep things as light-hearted as possible, the following discussion on the content of robots will be split into 2 sections. One that treats the film as though it were in a bubble that covers the characters, story, animation, and other technical elements, and the other likely being why you clicked on this video, the various allusions the film makes to Western society and how it almost radicalized an entire generation. My reason for tackling the film in this manner is not only because it presents a distinction between how one views robots as a child compared to as an adult, but I also want to demonstrate how, even beyond its slightly socialist undertones, the film is still fantastic in its own right. One of the attributes of robots that left an impression on me was the abundance of talent and passion found in the voice cast. Easily one of the better lineups of celebrity casting for an animated film of that era, or perhaps even overall. Not one of the main actors here is phoning it in. Many developed unique voices for their roles, creating distinct personalities for these characters to a point where I don't have to suspend my disbelief, unlike with other celebrity voice castings. Robots came out during a time where, to a famous on-camera personality, voicing a character in an animated film was still viewed as a great prestigious honour. For many celebrities of that era, this was a bucket list item, and as such, they truly wanted to deliver great and passionate performances that brought their characters to life, which you can recognise in listening to them talking about their characters and how they approached the unique challenge of voice acting, demonstrating a clear respect for the craft as well as their trust in the creative vision of Chris Wedge as the director. Well, all except for Drew Carey as Crank. He just thought it would be a real hoot.
I just decided I wanted to do it just to be in a big animated movie.
While I greatly admire the work of the entire cast, special credit must be given to Ewan McGregor, Robin Williams, Greg Kinnear, and Jim Broadbent, who are the ones carrying this film, stealing every scene. Ewan McGregor as the central protagonist may often be overlooked because Rodney himself is not particularly funny, not receiving nearly the same amount of notable one-liners as everyone else, and acting as more of a comedic straight man to the bigger personalities he's surrounded by. But McGregor imbues Rodney with a captivating sense of hopeful optimism and charisma you can't help but love while conveying this arc of disillusionment he undergoes throughout the story, witnessing how cruel the world can be and losing faith in his role model while still always finding the strength to take a stand against injustice.
All I ever wanted was to grow up to be like him.
And that passion and selflessness in turn inspires those around him to take action.
Why are you gonna help us?
Oh, because I want to grow up to be like you.
By Rodney's side in the rise against fashionism is his semi-loyal friend Fender Pinwheeler, powered by the unbridled energy of Robin Williams.
Stick with me, kid. I know this town like the back of my hand. Hey, that's new.
While introduced as a shaky scam artist who attempts to rob an unconscious Rodney of his foot, the two soon develop a strong bond that the film attempts to develop in its second act, though with how many other elements the movie has to juggle, their relationship ends up mostly falling to the wayside. You'll never see these two on any list of the best animated duos. Still, the film does manage to show an adequate amount of warmth between these two machines through a handful of tender moments or simply showing that when things are dire, the two do have each other's backs. The likability of Fender entirely hinges on Robin Williams' performance, which to me is one of the great Master of Comedy's most underrated. Made distinct from his tenure as the genie thanks to his sporadic and skittish energy that toes the line of unhinged, helped no doubt by the man's fantastic improv. When you look at the story, Fender doesn't seem to hold much significance, being used far more as comic relief than as a contributor to the plot. However, I'd argue Fender, whose main joke is the fact he can't quite seem to keep himself together, is crucially important as he is our gateway character. Only through his experiences does Rodney, and by extension the audience, learn about the way the ruling class treats outmodes leading up to the impending eradication, while also showing firsthand how desperately cruel the robots of the lower class have had to become just to survive.
You consider me a friend?
Sure, what else would I consider you?
I don't know. An embarrassment, a way to rebel against your parents, a desperate cry for help. The list is endless.
In the pantheon of animated villains, Phineas T. Ratchet remains on the lower end in terms of memorability, especially considering other evil contenders from 2005. But Greg Kinnear's exceptional performance elevates him far above your typical cookie-cutter corporate villains, simultaneously able to convey an unimaginable aura of power while also displaying clear fear and deep insecurities. It's this excellent balance between intimidating and utterly pathetic that makes him both a surprisingly complex antagonist and a realistic depiction of a billionaire. Someone who hides behind his dangerous weapons and mask of authority, but will immediately cower at any physical confrontation, leading to some of the film's most entertaining moments.
Can I just make one more heartfelt plea?
Okay, what did you want to say?
Oh my gosh, I'm as crazy as my mother.
Speaking of Ratchet's mother, Madame Gasket, portrayed brilliantly by Jim Broadbent, is the other half of this nefarious plot, with her son being the face of the operation while she resides underground as the twisted mastermind, essentially living through her son. No matter how awful Ratchet is in his own world, whenever he finds himself with his mother, he's reduced to being a subservient little boy striving for approval that always seems just beyond his reach. She still has this incredible hold on him. Despite her receiving comparatively less screen time and knowing nothing of her motivations or backstory, I believe Madame Gasket is an endlessly fascinating character, which I'll expand upon when I start discussing the many ways one may interpret the film's content. Make no mistake though, Robots is very much an ensemble piece. Besides those primary four characters, the film features no shortage of supporting players who leave an impression on the viewer. The remaining members of the Rusties, a group of outcasts that Fender is a part of whom Rodney befriends, are made up of Lug, a gentle giant voiced by Harland Williams.
Don't ever make him mad.
Why? What happens?
We don't know. He's never been mad.
Crank, a sardonic defeatist who uses humour to cope in these unprecedented times, voiced by Drew Carey.
Never try, never fail. Those are the words I live by.
Diesel, a bot designed after a circuit breaker who attempts to replace his missing voice box, leading to hilarious antics, though you could argue he is representative of this idea that the greater population of Robot City have, in a way, lost their voice. Whether or not that's what the filmmakers intended is entirely up to individual discretion. And then there's Piper Pinwheeler, played by Amanda Bynes. Fender's rambunctious little sister, who before Rodney was the most outspoken in protesting the treatment of outmodes in the city. She also has a crush on Rodney that is entirely superfluous and was some lame attempt to spark a love triangle with Rodney's actual love interest. Cappy, voiced by Halle Berry, is the only higher up at Big World Industries post-takeover with any remaining sense of integrity or independent thought. Initially, she is merely trying to save Rodney's life by convincing him to return home, but soon enough gets pulled into his mission to find Big Weld and set things right. While I greatly appreciate the concept behind Cappy as a character, representing the belief that the only way to enact meaningful change is from within the system after joining, in terms of personality, she leaves a lot to be desired, which is a tragedy because earlier versions of the script gave us much greater insight into her backstory, which would have helped her significantly. Listen to how Halle Berry describes her here.
But she also has another issue because she realizes that while she's a beautiful, pretty bot, all new parts, she realizes that she's traded in all of her old parts for upgrades to get a better position at her job. And Rodney helps her realize, you know, you were better than that. You didn't have to do that. You could have kept your old parts and you still could have had this job. You didn't have to kind of sell out.
Somewhere in the development process, this aspect of her character got lost, and it's a real shame that this is how she ended up in the final version. Big Weld, voiced by legendary director, actor, writer, and comedian Mel Brooks, was once the sole benefactor of Robot City, who sought to inspire other bots to fulfill their potential and invent things that would improve the well-being of others. Though he was ousted from his company in a hostile takeover, turning him into a lonely recluse until Rodney inspires him to fight back. Brooks does such a fantastic job portraying both sides of Big Weld as the inspirational TV personality and hopeful visionary of the past, as well as the bitter, jaded, and defeated Big Weld of the present.
Go home, kid. If he beat me, he's gonna beat you.
But
The world you're looking for no longer exists. You missed it.
Mel Brooks simply has such a captivating voice that makes you believe in the dream of Big Weld just as much as Rodney, with an abundance of kindness and wisdom as he's pulled out of self-imposed retirement to dream of a better tomorrow again. Aunt Fan, played affectionately by Jennifer Coolidge, is the big-hearted mother figure of the Rusties, taking them all in along with Rodney without asking for anything in return, following in the tracks of Big Weld as a way to demonstrate both the positive impact he had on other bots while also highlighting the devastation caused by his absence.
Just make yourself at home.
thank you. That's very kind of you.
My pleasure. See a need, fill a need.
She also has an absolutely huge crush on him. While certain assets made her one of the film's most visually memorable characters, it was her bottomless kindness that made her far more than a dispenser of physical comedy. It's nearly enough to forget that she has canonically committed street lamp slaughter. The final characters worth discussing are Rodney's parents, played by Stanley Tucci and Diane Wiest respectively, who do a fine job fulfilling their roles as Rodney's emotional support and motivation, though there's not much to them besides that, down to Mrs. Copperbottom not even being given a first name. Strange, because I could have sworn she was called Mary, but I guess I was misremembering. Herb does get a bit more characterization, and it is refreshing to see a story where most of the parental support stems from the father. Though Rodney's parents are mostly used as narrative tools, showing how far-reaching Ratchet's takeover is, and the idea that if Rodney can't stop him and Madame Gasket, it won't take long before they too would become casualties in the genocide of Outmodes, making simply returning home, as many characters suggest, not a viable option for him. But while the characters drive the story and endear audiences, the true star of this movie is the world the team at Blue Sky had crafted. After all, these visual ideas are what fueled initial development, with the form and function of Robot City itself taking a year for the crew to figure out. The aim was to design something so otherworldly that you'd think there was no way humans could have made it, as if this was an alternate universe that has always existed that the filmmakers and their cameras happened on by chance. And while most often we remain acutely aware we are watching something designed by humans, there are instances where one loses themselves in the sheer majesty and scale of this world, especially moments in which we are shown the world through the eyes of Rodney. The film's visual language was of course led by William Joyce, whose love of roundness and spiral patterns is felt throughout the environments, a style the crew labelled Big Little Tiny, starting with large shapes that give the viewer's eyes a place to rest, then around that would be little shapes and tiny details to further add scale and definition. As for the abundance of more rounded shapes, they allow for a sense of playfulness and whimsy, but also make locations like the Chop Shop, which features more hard angles, feel truly alien and threatening. It's these intricate yet unobtrusive details that makes robots such a visual delight, as no matter how many times you've seen it, there'll always be something new to discover. While it was his style that served as the foundation, he heavily encouraged other concept artists like Michael Knapp, Greg Couch, Daniel Lopez Munoz, David Gordon, and Todd Winter to experiment with the look and make it their own, fleshing out these base ideas into a fully realised world the characters could inhabit. Elements like everything in Aunt Fan's house scooping in to accommodate her particular figure showcase the level of detail that went into making the environments feel lived in. While the team desired to create something otherworldly, they still wanted the audience to find something in the design they could connect with and recognise, which is where the idea of using everyday objects as inspiration for the characters and backgrounds came about, down to Joyce touring antique stores to eventually build a full model of Robot City that would take over his living room. They were getting a picture of the world they were creating, but the pieces weren't quite fitting together just yet. The true eureka moment came when they discovered a magazine ad that showcased the inner workings of a watch with its face removed, helping them understand the city as one huge working machine where everything was interconnected. This idea is likely best represented by one of the film's most iconic sequences, Rodney's trip on the Crosstown Express. Following his arrival, Rodney's first impression of Robot City is experiencing public transportation, getting flung all over town by various Rube Goldberg-esque contraptions, or more specifically W. Heath Robinson, an English cartoonist the crew learned of that envisioned elaborate machines in a similar vein who happened to predate Goldberg, though on the other hand the sequence was also heavily inspired by the board game Mousetrap. Almost every artist was positively giddy about contributing to this sequence that would become the film's crown jewel, though it may surprise you to learn this sequence was never storyboarded. As with more action-heavy moments like this that require you to feel the pacing, the team would go straight into the computer, with co-director Carlos Saldana and lead animator Gallen Chu working with a previs version of the city to find the camera angles and define the action that would sell the intensity and excitement of the sequence early on. Though this sequence also serves as important foreshadowing, as during it we catch brief glimpses of each level of the city Rodney will visit on his adventure, an overwhelming departure from where he started. In particular, I want to draw your attention to the contrast created between Robot City and Rodney's home of Rivet Town. The suburban settlement is all very uniform, with near-identical streets comprised of near-identical buildings spaced out evenly. It's meant to feel confined and drab so the audience understands why Rodney feels so unfulfilled and stifled by this environment. Yet the rather dull colours look almost radiant compared to Robot City, whose skyline has far more varied postmodern architecture, but it's covered in varying solar shades of grey and chrome that stand out heavily against the blue and orange skies, as well as our more vibrant heroes. It's meant to convey the harshness of this unfamiliar territory, but also shows how unwelcoming the upper levels of the city have become towards outmodes, whereas on the ground level, there remains life and hope, with buildings like Aunt Fan's house and those surrounding it fighting against the conformity. Another cog in the film's finely oiled storytelling machine is its use of colour theory in the lighting, which is credited primarily to colour stylist Thomas Cardone. Throughout the runtime, you'll find that typically friendly locations are characterised by these bright red and orange hues, whereas more hostile environments take on monochromatic blues and greens. You can see this through the difference in how Big World Industries is presented in both the past and the present. Praise also needs to be given to colour designer Vincent Yen and Dai Satsumi, who handle the colour keying, which is when an artist creates a series of illustrations that will dictate how each scene is coloured, essentially creating a baseline for how the finished movie should look. When they set out to make this movie, one of the crew's many artistic goals was to change the public perception on what a robot design could look like, feeling there hadn't been much innovation beyond the basic soup can design, with a few exceptions like Fritz Lang's film Metropolis. All the research and experimentation that the crew undertook to get the look of the film just right essentially led to them becoming mechanical engineers.
There was an exhibit at the Guggenheim, of all places, of the art of the motorcycle. And we went to that, and that, like, all of a sudden you could look in these motors and the construction of these old motorcycles through the ages that you could just see a person, you could see a being in there, and the carburetor. I mean, it just started clicking. And so we just started looking at motors and typewriters, and and mixers and blenders and all these like household appliances, and you could really start to see a character evolve out of them.
Rather than looking at the movie as speculative fiction through the lens of what if, the approach instead became more of a what is mentality, which would connect with the audience better by having something they could somewhat recognise. Now, this might be a rather controversial opinion to have, especially since I've seen some people who absolutely loathe them, but this film has peak character design. Each and every character from the main cast to the background bots have clearly defined and distinct silhouettes, which was thanks to new techniques the team developed that allowed incidentals to be rendered with nearly as much detail as the stars. Much like the backgrounds, real-world objects were used as inspiration when it came to building these guys, and so much work was put into making these robots feel alive just in the look of them. My favourite design is likely Fender, despite him being one of the most human-like, at least in terms of his build. But with his last name being Pinwheeler, he's fitted with all these various spinning parts, which both puts further emphasis on how he is barely being held together, while also elevating Robin Williams' whirlwind and erratic performance. But like everything else, arriving at this point proved to be a very daunting task for the crew, as it would end up taking them 2 years just to design Rodney, because according to Joyce, they were designing a movie star and didn't want to miscast him. In fact, the only disagreement between Chris Wedge and William Joyce to occur during production was on the shape of Rodney's shoes. Inspiration was eventually struck when Wedge brought in an old motor that had belonged to his grandfather, also likely influencing the idea that all of Rodney's parts as he grew up would be hand-me-downs. But it wasn't until Peter DeSev, the film's designer, took a stab at it did the Rodney we all know and love begin taking shape. One detail of Rodney's design that you might not think twice about is his hairline, which itself has the ability to emote, being slightly pulled down or lifted depending on how Rodney feels at any given moment. A small detail that adds further personality and allows the audience to identify with him. This is also a minor example of ways in which the crew attempted to find an appropriate balance between staying true to the materials the characters were made from, while still ensuring they were articulate, warm, and expressive. Ideas that seem almost in direct opposition to each other. To achieve this, the animators had to experiment with all sorts of techniques and ways they could slide the metal to create expressions in the characters without distorting their geometry. This was a process they labelled deformation, which was easier with some characters than others. According to Mike Thermaya, the film's animation lead, Cappy was the hardest character to animate because of how subtle she was, with a lot of time being spent getting the facial posing right so she wouldn't appear dead or android-like. However, sometimes the lack of motion also builds character, with little deformation techniques used on Ratchet or Madame Gasket, allowing them to intentionally slip into the uncanny valley, making them all the more unsettling. As far as early CGI animated movies go, the visuals of robots hold up shockingly well, mainly due to how its lighting, textures, and rendering pushed the industry forward, with multiple new technologies being developed for scenes taking place in the chop shop, as well as the domino sequence inside Big World's mansion, all thanks to Blue Sky's research and development team headed by Carl Ludwig. When it came time to start looking into textures, Chris Wedge's old motor, which had already inspired the final look of Rodney, was found to be quite useful once again. The piece of machinery helped the artists understand how the curve of an object dictates how paint chips off and where dirt or oil tends to collect over time, which helped make the characters and buildings look appropriately weathered. There had never been an animated film with quite the same level of complexity and richness in its visuals before Robots, especially when compared to Blue Sky's first theatrical venture. A scene from Ice Age would contain maybe 24 pieces of geometry, whereas a scene from Robots had thousands, with Rodney alone being made up of over 400 individual pieces. And if you want to learn more about the artistry and development of Robots, you could check out the official art book by Amid Amidi, provided you have 2 working kidneys and wouldn't mind parting with one of them. Or you could follow the link in the description to the Internet Archive where the whole thing has been uploaded in its entirety. And considering they just saved you a small fortune, why not send some of that money the Internet Archive's way and help them in their mission to preserve the vast history and information on the World Wide Web while ensuring it remains accessible to all, because that is something we simply cannot afford to lose. And that still barely scratches the surface of all the talent and love that went into crafting this movie. I mean, I didn't even get to covering John Powell's wonderful score, his first collaboration with Blue Sky before he would later go on to define the Ice Age franchise's musical identity with the second, third, and fourth installments. But now it's time to move on to why I originally wanted to make this video and why I'm assuming a lot of you clicked on it. Because it is impossible to talk about robots without addressing its social commentary and anti-capitalist undertones. Even when I was trying to cover the film's production and technical elements, it kept cropping up, because that ethos is so fundamentally tied to everything in this film. From where I stand, the reason Robots is a film so ripe for deeper discussion is because it simultaneously says a lot and also very little. What I mean is there are blatant themes and ideas like community and an exploration of how the rich can only exist at the expense of the poor, but in many of these it remains just vague enough to leave room for multiple interpretations of the text. Thus for this section, I want to focus on all the various angles I've been able to look at this film from, and if you have a different view or believe there's something I may have overlooked in my analysis, be sure to leave your thoughts in the comments so we can discuss it further. Before we get into the real meat, or metal of the story, we need to address something a tad more tangential that still contributes to the film's longevity. Let's talk about robots' interesting relationship with gender identity. Because robots are not human, they are essentially agender. Yes, they are technically assigned a gender at birth, but due to the nature of robots and how they age, one can present and build themselves in whatever way will align with how they identify. The ease at which a bot can change or modify their body to properly reflect themselves makes the exploration of these ideas all the easier for them, with the rest of the world perceiving you the way you want to be perceived, giving them a level of freedom in self-expression humans are not so easily afforded. But this sense of freedom is exactly what Ratchet is trying to take away with his upgrades, forcing the rest of the world into a strict binary with limited to no options for self-expression. By his ideology, anything colourful or unique is a flaw, as he attempts to force this standard on everyone, with the marketing of the upgrades themselves playing into the unobtainable beauty standards that have plagued humans for centuries. Because if we're all guilted or pressured into striving for the same thing, we all end up in the same box, which is exactly where they want us. This brings me to the main point of interest with this topic, the gender Fender. Towards the end of the second act, Fender briefly ends up in the chop shop, during which they are separated from their legs and grab the first pair they see as a replacement, which so happens to feature a skirt and some heels. This is similar to an event that took place earlier in the film where Rodney is given his cousin Veronica's hand-me-down parts during high school, which is meant to be one of a handful of jokes in the film that were in poor taste. It's still the 2000s after all. But even that can be seen through a more positive lens. Rodney, despite identifying as male, essentially goes through female puberty as a teenager, but at his graduation, we see him throw those parts away, a moment that people with similar experiences could possibly find very affirming. The major difference with Fender though is following their bottom surgery, it virtually takes no time for them and the others to accept this change, besides again one or two moments that aged like milk.
Oui, sir. I'm a woman.
Ouch.
But for the rest of the film, Fender is shown to be incredibly confident in their new, more feminine presentation, showing no insecurities about this new form. Granted, there were more important things going on at the time than what was below their waistline, yet even by the end of the film, after spare parts are widely available again, meaning they'd theoretically be able to get some new legs, they still maintain this change, meaning from this point on, they are choosing to stay like this. It doesn't even faze their returning love interest, proving once again that gender in this world simply does not exist as we recognize it. While it definitely was not intended to be viewed this way by the creative team, who simply thought it'd be funny to show Fender struggling to walk in heels, they could have easily been far more mean-spirited about it, which for 2005 is unfortunately quite commendable. I do think there is a decent argument to be made that Fender and robots as a whole could be seen as good representation. Okay, not quite good, but mostly positive for the time it was made at least. But let's address the mechanical elephant in the room. The whole dystopian world of robots and the cruelty of Ratchet's empire is a massive allegory for private healthcare, how it is a system put in place by the rich and powerful for the sole purpose of holding onto their status by ensuring the lower class remains in poverty, while also increasing their desperation in the hopes of turning them all against each other to prevent them from rising against the ruling class and taking back power. power. It's never outright stated, but heavily implied that before the change in management, the world relied solely on Big World Industries for their healthcare. Heck, the baby-making kit Herb and his wife order to build Rodney itself comes from the company. So it's safe to assume at least a majority of the population is entirely dependent on them continuing to produce and distribute affordable spare parts. Then, under Ratchet's leadership, the company discontinues all spare parts, realizing there is more money to be made by only giving people the option of costly upgrades, or else they will become outmoded and risk being dragged away to the chop shop. In other words, the citizens of Robot City are presented with a choice between an unaffordable medical procedure or near certain death. And let me remind you who runs the chop shop, meaning whether a robot lives or dies is a non-issue, because Ratchet and Madame Gasket stand to profit from them either way. You may wonder how they can carry out this entire operation seemingly unopposed. As far as Rivet Town goes, we do see a City Hall building confirming that democracy does exist in some form in this universe, yet there is no mention of any elected officials in Robot City. That's because Big World Industries is the sole governing body. Robots is the cautionary tale of what would happen if a billionaire with severe parental issues who has spent almost their entire life surrounded by yes men was able to unlawfully obtain unchecked power to do whatever he wants, including indirectly or directly murdering anyone who disagrees with them and face no consequences.
Take him for a drive and bring me back his exact weight in paper clips.
As for showing the devastating effect this corporate fascism is having on the greater population, look no further than the scene that precedes Rodney deciding to help repair everyone. An elderly bot falls apart in the street while begging for help, and all the surrounding crowd sees is a pile of spare parts as they begin scavenging the remains. These bots have been pushed so far they are willing to steal what they need against any better moral judgment. They are desperate and at their breaking point, which, as mentioned, is not a flaw, but the system working exactly as intended, making the lower class isolated and selfish before they have a chance to mobilize, at least not until the final act after Rodney inspires them. A corporation has restricted people's access to life-saving medical treatment solely to boost their bottom line, which has far-reaching ramifications as we explore through Herb's condition. After Rodney leaves for Robot City, his parents discover Herb requires a replacement part right after they were all discontinued, and it's communicated very clearly that Herb vitally needs this part even beyond the threat of him becoming an outmode. And there's no chance of a man who works as a dishwasher being able to afford Ratchet's upgrades, otherwise Rodney wouldn't have had entirely hand-me-down parts while growing up. The purpose of this in the narrative, though, is to give our heroes a greater sense of urgency now that there is kind of a race against time for Rodney to put an end to Ratchet and Madame Gasket's fascist movement before it has a chance to reach Rodney's home and family. Which brings us to Madame Gasket herself. Remember way earlier when I said I found her character utterly fascinating? Well, here is why. Madame Gasket is perhaps the oldest robot we see in the film, or at the very least a similar age to Big World, as the pair seem to have at least something of a history.
Gasket, you're a sick, twisted, evil robot.
I try.
As I've said, nowhere in the film are we treated to any real insight regarding her backstory or motivations, but simply looking at how the robot society functions does shed some light on her role in the story. From her age and disheveled appearance, she herself could likely be an outmode, not only making her a class traitor, but recontextualizing her desire to purge the world of outmodes as an act of internalized bigotry. With this interpretation, the idea of outmodes could potentially be used to represent queerness, with Gasket being similar to how many homophobes are themselves closeted and attacked LGBTQIA+ people either out of resentment for not being able to live as openly as they do, hence why she lives underground, or because their mere existence creates uncomfortable questions about their own identity which they are unable to handle. Though that may be stretching things a tad. I also believe that the idea of outmodes and the horrifying system in place that attempts to eliminate them could be an exploration of how disabled people are often treated in society. Becoming outmoded is something that could potentially happen to anyone at any time, and isn't simply a factor of age, as we see multiple characters of different generations deal with this reality. It's of course not a perfect metaphor, because these robots are obviously machines who, if they had the means, could easily be fixed, as shown by the ending, which is pretty messy for this reading, but again, I'm not saying this is the definitive way to view the film. I definitely don't have the authority to do that. I'm simply explaining ways one could potentially look at it. When a robot is designated too broken, they no longer have a place in society and are immediately discarded. But the truly disturbing element of this is how almost everyone has pretty much accepted it. Besides Rodney, who didn't know any of this before he arrived in the city, we never really see anyone speaking out against the idea of the sweepers, or that a person can randomly be labelled as having no value and killed by order of the government as a result. Like, of course no one likes it, but there's this unsettling complicity and resignation that this is just the way things are. A deleted scene does attempt to explain the notable lack of any rumblings of a revolution, because in this version, the idea of sweepers taking out modes was more of a rumour than common knowledge as it is in the final film. But that chilling sense of complicity is one I find especially relevant today, as it speaks to what we are currently experiencing, with governments deciding which minority groups are worth sacrificing to the fascism machine, not understanding that once they've finished with one, they're just going to immediately jump to another until there's no one left but them, throwing already vulnerable people under the bus just to save their necks a little while longer, and we're already seeing how cowardly and ineffective that strategy is. So it's a good thing Robots teaches us about the power of class solidarity and the importance of working as a community. Though the film does have quite a big issue that stands in the way of any pro-socialist message it may attempt, that being the concept of a good billionaire. And don't get this twisted, I'm not saying Big Weld is secretly a bad guy. I love Big Weld, but the film's ending where he returns to power and immediately fixes everything is a tad reductive in my opinion. It's similar to those classic stories that end with the once deposed king being reinstated to the throne after defeating the tyrant monarch that replaced them. Sure, the new guy is far less likely to enslave his people, but how do we know the next heir won't be even worse than the previous guy? It's an ending that simply puts a band-aid on a much larger problem, creating a short-term happy ending for the characters we've been following without ensuring the problem is also fixed for future generations. So long as there is money to be made out the exploitation of others, there will always be Ratchets and Madame Gaskets ready to take advantage of the less fortunate because the system allows them to. Big Weld Industries is still essentially monopolising healthcare at the end of the day, with no competition or anyone to hold them accountable besides Big Weld himself and Rodney, who likely won't be around forever. If this happened once before, how can we be so sure it won't happen again? The simple answer is, we can't. And of course there'll be people inside the system like Cappy who attempt to speak out against these inhumane actions, but as this film showed, those tactics remain ineffective. Even unintentionally, the ending of Robots raises the loaded question of, is the system we abide by at all salvageable via intensive reform, or does it need to be torn down entirely and rebuilt from the ground up with fairness and equality at the centre? A 2005 family film was never gonna provide an answer to that, and neither will a 24-year-old's analysis of said 2005 family film. It's a very simple and idealistic ending that was chosen with the target audience in mind, and besides the dance party ending, it's perfectly serviceable as a conclusion to the story. Also, there's no way the team behind a big budget Hollywood movie would ever openly admit to said movie being so overtly anti-industry, especially when you take into consideration who happens to own it now, which is also why it will never be acknowledged again in any official capacity. Upon its release 20 years ago, Robots was a decent financial success, earning around $260 million at the box office against an $80 million budget, which for only the second film by a still relatively new studio was not bad at all. In fact, compared to the revenue of all of Blue Sky's other non-Ice Age films, the earnings for Robots was fairly average. Though it is impressive when you consider that Fox didn't really market this one all that much, especially when compared to Ice Age 2 the following year. Critically though, the film received more of a mixed reception, with many praising the visuals but dismissing the story as being underdeveloped and generic. I think you can tell I don't share that sentiment. When the film was released to home media 6 months later, it was accompanied by an all-new short featuring Ant Fan giving a tour of Robot City's train station, with misfortune befalling her tour group mostly caused by an eerily silent Fender. The only other thing worth discussing is the potential of a director's cut, which was first teased by Chris Wedge in the film's audio commentary on the DVD. It would contain alternate takes for several scenes, as well as more screen time to flesh out Cappy, which I've already mentioned. It'd also likely contain the infamous deleted scene wherein Big Weld is essentially lobotomized. Following the closure of Blue Sky in 2021, a small movement was formed to release this supposed director's cut, though nothing ever came of it. And at this point, I'm highly doubtful it will ever happen, because now the film is owned by Disney, who seem to want nothing to do with it. Still, it is a very fun idea to think about, especially since animated films don't typically receive director's cuts. But that's pretty much all there is to discuss regarding this film, so I guess we should wrap it up. To me, Robots is representative of everything animation can and should be, because when you really think about it, it's a movie entirely about art. Rodney embodies the spirit of the over 200 people who worked passionately to bring this world to life, persevering in the face of difficulty and dedicating themselves to getting every minor detail just right, proving you can truly shine no matter what you're made of. It has not only stood the test of time, but has somehow only gotten better with age, becoming even more relevant with each passing year. Whether or not that's a good thing, who's to say?
It's a ridiculous thing to do, to try to make a movie one frame at a time from something that does not exist, that isn't there. There's nothing in there. The box is empty. We have to fill it up and make it look convincing and real. That's ridiculous. That's an insane thing to want to do, and only a completely obsessed craftsman or a madman or a lunatic would attempt this thing. So you get enough of those guys together and you give them a few $1,000,000, you're gonna end up with something interesting and hopefully beautiful. And I think that, you know, we definitely got our freak on, and this thing looks out of sight.